This afternoon I'm painting on the Thunder Mountain Trail in West Sedona. I've got Chimney Rock behind me this way and then Thunder Mountain to the left. And I'm staring right over at the Munds mountain cliffs. And that's what I'll be painting on a kind of a panoramic format. It's 12 by 24 inches. And I'm really just trying to capture those really engaging big shadows caused by this low angled light. Right now I'm a little bit backlit, and the moon, the full supermoon, is rising tonight right above those cliffs. I think it'll be just past sunset when it will rise. It is a really beautiful evening in Sedona, and I'm super excited to share this demo with you all. So I'm really interested in painting this band of cliffs, and it feels like it might be a little repetitive. So I do want to create some strong variation in the shape and kind of cut it off at the right points for this panoramic format that I've got. And this is my palette. Right now I'm putting down those shadow colors. So the ultramarine blue, a little bit of the alizarin crimson, and then titanium white. And probably just a touch of the cad yellow medium. And I'm going to darken this a little bit more with that ultramarine blue and alizarin. I think it's important to start your painting in different ways. So most of the time I start with that kind of orange wash and do an alizarin crimson sketch, which is a great tried and true method. But every so often I like to switch it up. And I think that that is really important for growth and just for the type of scene that you're trying to capture. So here, for me, it's really going to be all about these kind of blue shadows, and placing these is really going to be what makes the whole painting work. So I decided to just start with kind of this abstract drawing of these shadows and sketching a little bit, with the shadow mixture that I just made. And right now I'm actually on the Chimney Pass loop, just a little ways. So I was hiking down the Thunder Mountain Trail from the Andante trailhead, and I needed to get up higher to see this view. So I'm actually kind of precariously right on the edge of the trail, but really on like a very steep slope. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to place that sky, which is cerulean blue, white, and then a touch of my cadmium yellow medium. And that's a pretty warm combination with the blue and the yellow. You're right at that horizon with the sky color. So, if you really frame out that piece of the scene, you're not going to get much of that deeper blue in the sky at all. You're really just getting where the top of the cliffs meet the sky. And so this is going to help me kind of be able to place the values for the rest of the scene. I've got my darkest dark already placed. And then I've got, I would say, like a middle to light up there for the sky. This whole ground plane here is going to be more of a mid-value. And then those highlights on the cliffs are going to kind of range from lights to like the lightest lights, because the sun is just blasting that rock. And I did, kind of pre-mix some of my piles of paint with a palette knife, because I really wanted a unified palette for this. And you'll see that I'm kind of going back into those cliffs and just laying the paint in a little more thickly and getting some of that warmer tone where the shadow transitions from like the vegetation to the sandstone that's in shadow. So seeing into the shadow is going to be really important here. And obviously I'm going to go back in there and lighten up some of those areas. But now I'm going to focus on getting the rest of this kind of blocked in so I can continue to refine it and work with the light before it changes too much. This green in that kind of slope before it meets the sandstone is quite far away. So this is a green that's got, quite a bit of desaturation, meaning, I'm relying on complement and white. So as it recedes, it's going to get lighter and less intense for color. And it almost deepens a little because the vegetation is more upright on this top tier here versus the sloping section below. I'm going to show you a little bit how I'm mixing. So I've got my ultramarine blue and the cadmium lemon yellow and the white for kind of the vegetation that's more in the light. There's actually a hillside just before, and that's going to be more saturated. So now I'm mixing the one that it has a larger mass, and that's going to have more blue and white. And I don't want this to be too gray. I still want it to read as green. I'm going to put a little bit of red in there for more of that top tier. And so that's kind of the range of green that I have going on. There's a strong temperature shift throughout all of these planes of green. Definitely a lot more yellow in that foreground that's getting hit with light. And then where it slopes and meets the cliffs, it's more of like a bluish green. You've really got that sense of atmosphere down there. And then up higher on the cliffs, it feels warmer, like there's more reds mixed in. But essentially, my yellow is slowly dropping out of the mixture as it recedes. And so that's always a really good rule of thumb when transitioning those greens. And now that I've got those placed, I can go with my sandstone in light. So that's a pretty strong yellow, I would say. So I've got the cad lemon, And I'm placing it right next to the shadow mixtures that I made because I can easily transition between those two. And you'll notice that, you know, yellow and violet are complements. So as the cliffs round into shadow, playing with those complements is going to kind of increase the vibration of that color relationship. There's a bit of the sandstone that's more orangey, and then some of it has like more yellow and white in it. So it's important to create that variation in the rock. So I don't know if I've ever talked about this before, but you are working with a lot of different types of rock in Sedona. So right now I'm primarily working with like this coconino sandstone layer and the Toro Weep formation, which is further up. And then it might be hard to tell from the film, but right below that layer is the Schnebly Hill formation, which is more of that like red rock. So that's going to transition from more of that yellow sandstone, and as it meets the vegetation below, you'll get more into those red tone sandstone colors. And so if I have like kind of an orange mixture, I can go either way with that. And I'm really just loving the light that's hitting this rock. I don't need to mix, you know, too much blue in there at all, or violet, because I feel like that pure color is really a match to, you know, how the light is lighting up those cliffs right now, even though it's in the distance. So even though it's important to desaturate colors and to harmonize the palette, it's also really important when to know when you can use those more like chromatic and pure color combinations and really get them to work. So what I want in this scene is for the light to really read and getting that three-dimensional feeling. You know, I don't want it to feel flat. I want it to feel like these are big monumental shapes kind of rising from the earth and into the sky. And I've got all these little bits of the sandstone that are kind of laid into the vegetation and at the ridgeline too. So many parts of this are pretty thinned out still, so that I can kind of work on those overlapping aspects. And even those little rocks at the top are casting some really beautiful blue shadows. So I've kind of got a pattern that I'm working with here. And I want to make sure that I'm not like making all the same marks and evenly spacing those cliffs. I really want to create variation in the shapes and in the forms to create interest. And it's more naturalistic too, because they really aren't too repetitive. And even if they are, you can kind of move things around just a little bit to break that up. So now I just started placing more of that red rock color. And I used the alizarin crimson and the cad lemon. But I'm using more of the alizarin in that mixture because it's more red. Mixing it into that shadow color a little, and then adding more red and yellow. So it's good to look at the sandstone as light and dark throughout the whole scene. Even though it looks like it's mostly in light, there is a little bit of that rock that you can see in the shadow as it transitions into that blue. And then I've got all these pieces of green that I can kind of place around it to integrate the rock. And so far, you know, it's still feeling more abstract, but everything that I'm placing is pretty intentional. So I want this block-in to be solid enough that I don't have to change too much around. I can just start to really thickly layer the paint. There's this beautiful cliff line coming in from the left, and there's really a lot going on. It's like more crumbly and harder to find like a solid shape. So what I might do is end up massing that group a little bit more. And that's something that I notice a lot in my own work, and even sometimes other people's work, is that there's this tendency to like break things into pieces too much. And what's going to help something read so much better is, you know, just massing all of those little things together and creating one big, like, readable shape. So kind of like a lot of times what we're doing in this practice of plein air painting is like creating the suggestion of the thing rather than the thing itself. You know, it's an impression, it's impressionism. I'm not going to be standing here for too long, so there's no way like I can articulate everything with this window of light that I have. And that's also the beauty of it. You know, I think the more simple it can be, like the more we can really relate to it. And I know when I look at art, when I can see that the artist, you know, took something that maybe had a million shapes and was able to express it in just 3, like that's what blows my mind. And that's what brings me that deeper sense of ease and harmony when I look at a work of art, just that like expression of a place. And it leaves more to the imagination, I think, too. So now I'm kind of getting to this place where I want to start thinking about the definition that I can create in the foreground. And this is probably going to shift around a little bit. So essentially, you know, how much of that red rock do I want to place? And, you know, at what points is the vegetation going to peek through? There is a little bit of some shadows because you do have some different like rolling hillsides, but essentially what I don't want to do is take away from that strong diagonal shape that I created, because I think that's really interesting and engaging and disrupts that kind of parallel line that I've created towards the top a little bit. And you'll see, you know, I attempted to make it a little more undulating than how it actually appears, but I think, you know, for this ground plane, there's going to be a little bit of back and forth. I'm kind of wrapping up my first session, and I didn't get here quite early enough. I got here when the shadow was perfect, and if I had gotten here just before the shadows started really moving in, it could have been a single session. So I came back out a little bit earlier now, and so I'm gonna clean this whole thing up and hopefully get it finished before the sun begins to set again. So you'll notice how much that light changes on the cliffs when the sun is setting. They just get so much more orange, and the shadow deepens a bit more into like a violet too. And the green really shifts a lot also. So this palette is what I'm interested in. And those shadows will continue to get longer again. But, this is what I'm interested in, more of that late afternoon light versus the sunset light. So now what I'm working on is just really refining these shadows in the cliffs, and then by virtue of working on the cliffs a bit more, on the light and the middle values within that shift and those transitions as well. So now I can really distinguish when I'm looking into those deep shadows, where is there some of that light being reflected from the sky, those blues, and the quality of edge work. So when does that shadow kind of blur on the edges, and when is it more of a hard edge? And this is something that you can really just observe in the landscape. There's so many different angles and elements happening with the light that it really helps to just be able to observe it in real time and put that mark down and adjust it based off of what you're seeing in front of you. It's such a beautiful mindfulness practice as well. And now I'm just unifying this shape a little more here by putting more of it into shadow. And you'll notice that the shadow here is a little bit more like of a violet rather than the blues casted by the cliffs further up and on the vegetation. And the cracks between the rocks are a little bit darker, so that's got more of the alizarin with the ultramarine blue. My red sandstone is going to have kind of a cooler orange because I want that, atmosphere to read. So what I've done is I've really pre-mixed a lot of these colors, and what I can do is slowly add saturation back over as I continue layering. So there were a bit more desaturated colors in my block-in, and I can kind of pick and choose where I want to increase the chroma a little bit. And that's really nice because, sometimes you only need a few spots where the color is more saturated for that whole plane to appear more colorful. Otherwise, if, there's too much saturation all over, it can feel maybe a little bit less naturalistic, and you kind of miss those beautiful harmonies that kind of naturally happen in the palette that you get with more of the block-in phase. And I really start loving the quality of the oil with the refining process, and as the paint gets more layered in there, and now I'm kind of doing more wet into wet because all of my values are placed. I have the range of color that I'm happy with, and I can really add some of those beautiful highlights now. So a little more orange and white mixed in for that sandstone that's getting more of the sunlight. And you can also see how that shadow is kind of advancing in the foreground. And that will just continue as the sun gets lower in the sky. And what I'll do frequently is I'll kind of mix that lower sandstone color into this upper tier. And that kind of just brings those rocks together a bit more and unifies the scene a lot. It does get a bit more orange at the top tier of the cliff. There's some nice warmth that I can see up there. And visually, there's just so much that the eye can really pick up on. The longer you stand in front of something and really observe it, you can just find like all of these beautiful nuances that can be really hard to just see from like a photograph or a video. And you can really see into the shadows quite a bit as well because of how big they're getting. And what I mean by seeing into the shadow is that you can see a whole lot more variation in the color and temperature, even a little bit in the value. What's really important is I keep that mass of value in the dark group, but within that group of darks, I can have lighter and midtones and dark and light accents. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of mixing a lighter lavender gray color. And when I say lavender gray, I mean lavender with a little bit of that cad yellow medium mixed into it because complements create really beautiful grays and browns, and white definitely. So you can see on the sides of the cliffs where they're rounding from shadow into light, I've kind of indicated the wall of the cliff in shadow a little bit more now with that kind of lighter, warmer color that I've created. And I kind of did that in the block-in as well, but then covered over it with those reflected blues coming in from the sky. So there's a lot of like, putting down and taking away and putting down that happens in the painting process. So it's important to not get too attached to, say you make a right decision. You want to know, why you made that decision, why you went back in and maybe took it out, and then why you went back in and added it again. So there's a lot of decision making, and even though you're kind of like really in the moment and capturing the light, this whole time, like it's good to have a plan so that you don't, end up chasing the light or muddying the colors by, making too drastic of decisions that don't really stick with the original plan. And also because you have those value groups, even if I'm painting a little bit lighter into those shadows, it will like darken because of that alla prima, because I've already established that value to be darker. And so that's something that I want, and that's something that I'm aware of when I'm going in and I'm layering back into those areas. Finding that unity in the value mass groups. I'm creating more shadow in this hillside. And I love where a little bit of that undulating vegetation in the hill kind of catches the light and then falls back into shadow. So seeing how I can kind of very loosely articulate that. And going back into my sky with a little more chroma, like a little more of that blue, yellow, white relationship going on. And as I'm going back into the sky, I'm just ever so slightly adjusting and petting that ridge line and kind of getting some of those edges to blend nicely. And keeping it really super soft. I really like the contrast between the softness of that sky and kind of the hardness of that ridge line. I kind of have this process, and I think all painters do, is you kind of work on sections, but really it's an all-over painting method. So I'll jump around a lot, I'll go to the sky and back down to the shadows, and pretty soon I'm going to go back into that like middle foreground hillside. And that gives you the opportunity to really like see how everything is, how like all the parts are connecting to the whole. So it can be easy to get like stuck in one part of the painting and forget about the other pieces that have to be refined as well. And so I've really developed this strategy of kind of doing this all over painting and making sure I don't get too hung up in one spot, especially when you're doing plein air. You can kind of get tunnel vision really easily. And so it's important to constantly step back, reevaluate, and make sure you're just addressing all pieces of the painting. I've lightened that ground a little bit and, cooled it a little bit. But I'm going to go back in and reestablish some of those shadows within that hill. So you've got all these like different tiers of rocks that are rising out of this grand landscape. And I don't, want to get too caught up in like getting the exact geology of what's happening. I just want to leave these like little suggestions of the variation in the hills and the rocks. I think that shape before I started adding some of those shadows was really nice, but it does feel like there needs to be a little more going on. And also, the more paint that you're able to start getting down, the more you're able to push those subtle temperature shifts. So I've got like, more of that reddish green up here. And integrating it with a little bit of those shadows. And you'll notice you know, when you've got like a valley or a canyon, you'll get like some of that blue or like atmospheric haze. There's all that vegetation in the foreground that is just like getting full on sunlight, but it's really far away. And so this group here is pretty much like mostly more of that yellow, bright green. But then I've kind of popcorned in some of the really dark shadows that those trees are casting against each other. And that breaks up that hillside a little bit. And I'm not trying to refine too much down there. I'm just really creating like the suggestion of some of those darks in the hillside. It might even be a little bit overkill, but you know, I can always go back in and edit more of the lighter green on top of it. That, I think, really communicates the depth of the perspective of the scene too. So it felt like that was an important piece to include. And figuring out how to kind of skillfully tuck some more of that red rock into that kind of middle ground hillside. Kind of connecting the dots, if you will. And I would say those parts of the painting are pretty similar in temperature and value, like the light of the cliff and the light of the hillside. And so what's kind of distinguishing them from each other is basically that color contrast. And I love these moments when you can see like how the cracks or the separation in the rocks kind of lead you in and through the painting. And it connects some of the different tiers as well. Might fill out that shadow a little bit more of the cliff on the right-hand side. So you'll see I've got like those two prominent faces. And then, you know, that smaller group of cliffs off to the left, creating that beautiful diagonal in the scene. So yeah, I think this is pretty much finished, and the light is kind of entering more of that sunset light versus that late afternoon light. So really was able to kind of capture that feeling. And then even still adding a little bit more of like a white yellow above the cliffs, just brightening the horizon a little bit there. Softening that sky even more. It's amazing how much distance you can create in an already distant scene. And I've always wanted to make a piece that really kind of speaks to this particular range of cliffs. So I was excited to choose the panoramic and, find a composition that I think works well and doesn't feel too repetitive. Got those final marks, just that orange cliff up there. And that's it. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next plein air adventure.